Okay, right. So it seems as though we had an issue with the tube stream. It didn't kick off, so I do apologize, and got us several messages from our YouTube community as well as those live on Zoom. So thanks. So what I'll do, just for the benefit, we'll spend about 5 minutes to just quickly flip through the slides that did not make the stream, just for the benefit. Again, in respect of those who are in the class and saw it, we'll just spin through very quickly. Right. So this is what we covered during the last session. So again, welcome everyone. This is session number 18, general class, amateur radio course. During our previous session, these are the topics we covered. In this evening's session, these are the topics that we'll be covering. If you are joining us on YouTube Live, this is level 2. There's a level 1 course. The link is on your screen. This is where we are with respect to our syllabus. Reminder to take practice exams. This is our Zello channel on the React Members channel, with networks on a Saturday and a Monday, 9 p.m. Atlantic. These are the links to access all of the material that we have distributed, including the videos that have been recorded. The book or the text that we're using for this course, the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide, as well as optional material that you may decide to purchase to help you. Right, so lightning protection, we'd have dealt with that. The main takeaway from this is that lightning protection, the lightning arresters, as well as grounding, are to be installed outside of your shack. Outside of, not inside. A lot of our safety regulations that we follow as amateur radio come from the NEC, the National Electrical Code. One of the important aspects of the code is the wire sizes associated with the various current carrying capacities that we need. So we have 2 exam questions, the American wire gauge numbers, as well as the current carrying capacity. And we have 2 exam questions for number 14 gauge wire, or AWG 14, it's 15 amps. And for number 12 AWG, it's 20 amps. The GFCI is a very important and useful protection circuitry built into receptacle outlets. It's the ground fault circuit interrupter, and we install it to protect against ground faults. Also, when we're installing fuses or circuit breakers, and in this case it's a 240 volt circuit, we only install the breaker on the hot wires, not on the neutral and not on the ground, only hot wires. The power supply interlock is a device when installed in a cabinet or inside of a chassis. Once we open it, if it contains live circuitry, it will disconnect the source, or it will de-energize the circuitry to protect us. Also, if we have an emergency generator that's operated on any kind of fuel like diesel or gasoline, we need to make sure it's well ventilated. We don't want to use a generator inside of the house. Also, we need to know about solder containing lead. Lead is very dangerous, potentially harmful to humans, and therefore make sure you wash your hands after you handle lead containing solder. Right, so that's a compressed version, again, because we had an issue with the YouTube stream. So again, apologies to everyone. Let's continue. All right, so this chart on your screen has been circulated in the file share, the gdocs.ttreact.com file share. You have a high resolution 11 by 17 version of this chart. We recommend that you maybe print it out or at least have an electronic copy with you and refer to it often. Become very familiar with this chart, because a lot of the exam questions are taken from this chart, but also as a licensed operator, you need to know this information to be able to operate properly, professionally, and with good amateur radio practice. This is some extra information here, just letting you know that on the HF bands, general class licensee have privileges on all of these bands. So if you're a technician, you wouldn't have all of this. But once you get your general class, you will have full privileges on all of these bands. So you see, once you sit the exam, this is what you get: access to all of the spectrum. Again, this is extra information. This is not actually in the exam, but we just thought we'll provide this to you. See G for general, and notice all of the spectrum that you get. Taken again from this chart. That's why you say this chart is important, it's helpful. Okay, so to some exam questions, they will ask you as a general class licensee, or maybe even for extra class, some information they'll want you to know about your privileges as a general class, what you probably also cannot do, or your exclusions. But to get them, you will need to become an extra class licensee. So I guess this question really is trying to encourage us to, well, okay, let's get our extra class as well, right? So let's talk a bit about this slide a little bit. It's a very busy slide, but let's discuss what's on this slide. So first of all, we did say, please become very familiar with this band chart. We are excerpting sections from this chart. So on these next several slides, many of those slides will contain excerpts from this. So if you want to know where we are getting a lot of the material for the next few slides, it's from this chart. All we are doing is cutting out the relevant section and focusing and highlighting that area for the particular theory and the particular question that we're dealing with. But all of that information is essentially copied from this. So that's why we say this chart is your friend. All right. So, for example, we have snipped out the 80 meter section of the chart here. So you can see the frequencies under 80 meters, 3.500 megahertz to 4.000 megahertz. And of course, it's split up, or it's segmented. The band has segments. And of course, the various colors will indicate what you can do, what mode, whether you can do voice, or you can do data, or you can do CW. The colors will mean what type of mode or transmission that you can do. So after a while, we should become quite familiar with the meaning of this chart, right? So let's go. So first of all, for technician, general, and extra class, each class level has different privileges, which means that you have access to some frequencies, but not others, depending on your class. Of course, the extra class has all, but the technician will have some, the general will have more, and the extra class will have all. So we need to be aware that the various classes carry different frequency privileges. So conceptually, we need to bear that in the back of our mind. Specifically for the exam, we need to know that on the HF bands, again, remember, we also have a chart that shows what is HF, what is VHF, what is UHF. So by now, we should all be familiar with, okay, once we're talking HF, we are talking essentially 3 to 30 megahertz, right? So that should be quite familiar in the back of our minds, approximately. Once the HF, 3 to 30 is what we typically will talk about, right? The amateur extra class, so this is the level above what we're doing. This is level 3. So it's called the extra class. Licensees have segments exclusively allocated and portions where general class licensees cannot transmit. So there are actually two questions inside of this bit of information here, right? However, they both mean the same thing. Extra class licensees have access to frequencies that general class licensees do not have on these 4 bands. So let's look at it diagrammatically. So on the 80 meter band, an extra class licensee has this piece of the spectrum. They can transmit voice between 3.6 and 3.8. Notice the general class here does not. The general class can do 3.8 to 4.0. But notice this space is void. It's blank for the general class. So the general class cannot transmit there at all on no mode, right? So again, green here, that is voice. Red is data, and this squiggly is CW or Morse code. So the extra class has the full thing, all of this. This is a deprecated class, a grandfather class called the advanced class. You can't get that license anymore. But if you're an advanced licensee, you can use this from 3.7 to 4. But as a general class, you can only use 3.8 to 4 megahertz. That's what you have access to as a general class licensee. You do not have access from 3.6 to 3.8. So that's why we're highlighting in these blue circles the relevant section so that you can see for yourself that when we say that on these HF bands, the general class does not have access to a range of frequencies, whereas the extra class would. So that's why I started that these two questions here, or the questions related to this, is kind of encouraging you, or encouraging all of us, that we should probably get our extra class if we want access to these privileges, right? So similar in the 40-meter band, we'll notice that the extra class has the full range, the full spectrum. They can do voice across this section here, but notice the general class can only do voice this range. The general class does not. There's a void, there's a space that's missing. The general class cannot transmit here at all, right? So hopefully that is illustrating the extra class has the privileges, whereas the general class does not, right? So extra class, general class. Note on the 20 meters, we have a similar situation going on. The extra class has the full range, but the general class only has part of it. So 14225 to 14350, this section here, but it does not have between 14150 and 14225. Hopefully you can see that. This is the range that general class does not have access to. So that's why we call it frequency exclusion, whereas the extra class has it as frequency privileges. Exclusion for the general class, privilege for the extra class. And similarly for the 15-meter band, again, the extra class has the full thing, but the general class only has a portion. Can do 21275 to 21450. But from 21200 to 21275, notice there's space. It's a void, nothing. Cannot transmit there legally, right? So the bands that we're talking about is the 80 meter, the 40 meter, the 20 meter, and 15. So it's a little bit of an oddball with the 15, so should be easy to remember. 80, 40, 20, so 40 is half of 80, 20 is half of 40. Well, okay, 15 is not really half of 20. But if you need an aid de memoire, 80, 40, 20, half, 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 and then the oddball here, which will be 15. Right? So the options you'll see when we come to the question pool, what you have. So 80, 40, 20, 15. All right, so hopefully this will all make sense. Let's go to some more slides. So folks, we are going extra time this evening to cover the material. So also, we need to be aware that general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portions of bands. But where they have privileges, the general class will have access to the upper frequency portion of the band. So if we were to break that down, what does that mean? So this is the 80 meter band from 3.5 to 4.0 megahertz. That's the frequency range, but it is segmented from 3.5 to 3.6, 3.6 to 3.7, 3.7 to 4, depending on the mode as well as the class of licensee. So the extra class, of course, in this case here has everything. The general class only has this bit here. But notice where the general class has access, it's the upper part of the band. It's not the lower part of the band. And that's the point of this first bullet point. If we were to take the 40 meter band as well, we'll notice that where the general class has privileges, it is the upper section of the band. Notice here, this is the upper section. Also, in the 15 meter band, similarly, where the general class has privileges, it's the upper section. So this is the upper section and this is the lower section. How do we get upper and lower? Lower frequency, higher frequency. So the upper, so when we refer to the upper frequency portion, this is what we mean. Right? So that's an exam question. When general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portion, such as these bands here, notice there are frequency exclusions for them. The portion of the voice segment that is available to them is the upper frequency portion, right? So that's why we put it visually here to show you that they have the upper frequency, not the lower portion of the voice. Again, greenest voice, right? So they don't have the lower portion here. They don't have the lower portion here. They don't have the lower portion here. They have the upper portion, all right? Also, we need to know for the exam that the frequency range that general class licensees are prohibited from operating as a control operator is 7.125 to 7.175, and that is in the 40 meter band. So we have that information here for you. It's 40 meters. So let's look at the 40 meter chart and see where did we get this bit of information from. Again, that's why we're saying this chart here is your friend. Print it out if you must. Nice. If you can print it 11 by 17, better yet, so you can see it the best resolution possible? Because all of these questions are coming from that chart. So let's look at it here. 40-meter band. This is the 40-meter band. The frequency range that the general class cannot transmit on is 7.125 to 7.175. That's what we're seeing in this exam question. Let's see if that is true. 7.125 to 7.175. Here we go. This is 7.125 to 7.175. You see this 7.125? And this is 7.175. So that is correct. The exam question is correct. The general class licensee is prohibited from operating here. They cannot transmit. So they make it sound a little fancy by saying that they're prohibited from operating as a control operator, right? A control operator is the person who sits in front of the radio and is speaking on it, right? Think about it that way. So what they're saying here, the general class cannot transmit on this portion of the band, 7.125 to 7.175. They do not have privileges, and that's what this bullet point is about. Let's get to the last bullet point on the slide. A frequency within the general class portion of the 15-meter band is 21,300 kilohertz. Now they're trying to mix up some things here for you, right? So they're talking about the 15-meter band. So we have extracted the 50-meter band of the band chart here, exploded it, and let's take a look at what this question is talking about. What do they mean by a frequency within the general class portion of the 15-meter band? Well, the general class portion of the 50-meter band, this is the 50-meter band here. This is the general class privileges. This is the advanced class privileges, right? And this is the extra class, right? So you have the G, A, E, right? G for general, A for advanced, E for extra. So this is the general class. Notice the general class portion is this, as well as this, but not this. So this last question is really asking, well, tell us about a frequency that the general class can actually transmit on in the 15-meter band. And they just chose one at random, 21,300. Now they give it to you in kilohertz here, right? They're trying to tie you up. This chart here, we have it in megahertz, but we know from previously units of conversion that 1 megahertz is 1,000 kilohertz. So this should not trip us up. So this is 21,300 kilohertz. It's also 21.3 megahertz. So where's 21.3 megahertz? Somewhere around here. That's where this blue dot is here. So all this is saying that is a general class operator on the 15-meter band can transmit on a frequency of 21,300 megahertz or 21,300 kilohertz. It's valid. If they gave us a frequency somewhere between 21.2 and 21.275, they would not have been able to legally transmit here. But because this general class level allows transmission in this portion of the band, the upper portion, this is a valid frequency. So hopefully this all makes sense. Let's continue. So we come now to the 10-meter band. Again, you're seeing why we say this chart is our friend. Again, we have the chart here. It's too difficult to see in detail. That's why you should have an exploded view, a large view, print it out if you must. But we've exploded, zoomed on in to the relevant section for the question that we are dealing with. So we're now talking about the 10-meter band. And we need to know that on the 10-meter band, a general class operator, a general class licensee can transmit on the entire band, and they can also do so on the mode called CW, right? So this is an exam question. You notice here, the extra, the advanced, and the general, they all have access to the full 10-meter band. That's what this means here. The novice and the technician doesn't, by the way, right? They do not. They only have a portion here. So hopefully this diagram is starting to make a little sense to us when we see novice, technician. This row here shows where they have privileges. Notice their privileges is from 28.000 to 28.5, but from 28.5 all the way to 29.7, they have no privileges. That's the novice and technician. But the extra class or the amateur extra, the advanced class, and the general class, the level we are doing, has access to the full 28.000 to 29.700 part of the spectrum, the full access, full privileges on the 10-meter band. And they just mentioned that, well, yes, you can do CW or Morse code on the entire portion. And that's the point here. On the 10-meter band, the frequencies that stations with a general class control operator may transmit CW emission is the entire band. And that is because they have all privileges there. Also, in relation to the 10-meter band, another exam question, They will ask you where or what portion of that band can you use for repeaters. Now, in the HF part of the spectrum, you can operate repeaters on the 10-meter band. It has enough bandwidth, or at least some bandwidth, to allow for repeater operation. You do not have those privileges on the other parts of the HF spectrum. But the 10-meter band is within the HF spectrum. Remember, HF is generally from 3 to 30 megahertz. 28 megahertz is less than 30. So this is the 10-meter band. And on that 10-meter band, you can operate repeaters from 29.5 megahertz to 29.7. So anywhere inside of there, you can operate repeaters. And that's the next exam question. The portion of the 10-meter band, that's available for repeater use. Remember what a repeater is? We transmit on one frequency, and the repeater will repeat on another frequency for wide area communication. Is the portion above 29.5, and that's why we have on the diagram here, we show you here the 29.5 megahertz marker, and we show you here that repeaters can operate anywhere in this part of the band, not below. All right, so one will ask, but wait a minute, if I'm a technician class operator, can I operate on the 10-meter band, right? So notice here that the technician class operator does have some privileges on the 10-meter band, but they do not have privileges all here. But can they operate on the repeater that another control operator who is operating the repeater, someone maybe have the repeater at their home, or maybe they have a high location, or wherever they are, they have a 10-meter repeater. Can this technician class licensee operate? Well, there's one condition under which they can do so. And that condition is that this repeater owner needs to be a general class operator, and they must also have the ability to transmit and receive on the 2-meter band. So the technician class operator, who would not normally have this portion of the 10-meter band privilege, can in fact operate through the repeater as a technician class operator, as long as the repeater owner, the repeater control operator, is a general class licensee. So they are essentially telling us that in this last bullet point exam question, that a 10-meter repeater may retransmit the 2-meter signal from a station that has a technician class control operator only if and only if the 10-meter repeater control operator holds at least a general class license. So this guy owns a repeater, he or she has a general class license. We have a technician class operator. They will transmit to the repeater on 2 meters, but the repeater will retransmit on 10 meters, and that is fine. That's an exam question. Let's move on to the 30-meter band. Again, the 30-meter band, a very small portion of the spectrum. It's 10.1 megahertz to 10.15 megahertz. It's a very small portion, and there are major restrictions. And we need to know that for the exam. On the 30-meter band. On the 30-meter band, phone operation is prohibited. What do we mean by that? Remember when we said phone in amateur radio, it means voice. So that means we cannot talk or we cannot speak on the 30-meter band. It's prohibited. Also, on the 30-meter band, image transmission is prohibited. So we cannot do images either. Major restriction, right? But notice we can do red, digital modes or data modes, right? So these two are exam questions. In the 30-meter band, phone operation is prohibited. Also, 30-meter band, image transmission is prohibited. And you can see that here. We have excerpted it out from this diagram here. The 30-meter band, notice all we are seeing here is red, and red means RTTY and data. So you cannot do voice. You cannot do image. That's what this means. So hopefully, as we go through each of these slides, interpreting this band chart, hopefully the pattern starts to show up. Okay. Again, we're now talking about the 60-meter band. So for the 60-meter band, so we have excerpted the 60-meter band segment from this chart as well. Notice something here about the 60-meter band, at least in the US, right? It is not a frequency range that you can tune to any frequency you like. It has very clearly segmented frequencies. They have been channelized. So you have this channel, you have another channel, and so on, right? So you have these 5 channels. So we cannot do what we call VFO mode and use our tune and dial and tune to any frequency inside of there, at least not in the United States. It's channelized operation. So that's an exam question. On the 60 meter band, communications is restricted to specific channels, and that's why we say channelized, rather than frequency ranges, or what we sometimes refer to as VFO, variable frequency oscillator. That's when we use our tune and dial or up-down button and we tune to any frequency in kilohertz steps sometimes, right? So we cannot just tune to any frequency. We have to use these specific frequencies because it's channelized, or we call specific channels. Exam question. All right. Also, we need to define the concept of primary and secondary users. So we did talk about it a bit in the technician level, what a primary user, what a secondary user is. But we need to know for the exam that the FCC may designate an amateur operator as secondary on a particular band. So if we are secondary on a band, and by the way, there are two bands that for sure we are secondary on, the 30 meter band and the 60 meter band. So the one that we have up here, as well as the one we showed before. The 30 meter band, we are secondary here on the 30 meter band. We are also secondary on the 60 meter band. But what does it mean to be secondary? Well, it is opposed to or opposite to being primary. We are not primary. When we are secondary, what it means is that we must not cause harmful interference to the primary user. We are not the primary, we are the secondary. So we cannot cause harm, we cannot interfere with the primary users, whoever they may be. But they could interfere with us, right? So that is what being primary and secondary is about. When you're primary, you can interfere with a secondary user and they must accept it. But if you are secondary, you must not at all, at any time, interfere with a primary user. Okay, so that's the exam question. When the FCC rules designate the amateur service as a secondary user on a band, and we put in here, for example, the 30 meter band, the 60 meter band, amateur stations must not cause harmful interference to primary users and must accept interference from primary users. Okay, just some extra information here. If you're secondary on a band and you're using it and you start to get interference, well, you have a couple choices. You can move to another frequency or just simply stop using it. Okay, this is a little bit extra information that talks about the various ITU regions. Right? So you can read this at your own time. Right, so let's continue. Antenna structures. As a ham, this is our shack, our house, our building, our apartment, whatever. We have our antenna structures. But we need to be aware for the exam that the maximum height of our antenna structure, right, is 200 feet if we are not near an airport. Because if we are near an airport, we will need to get special approval from the aviation authorities, as well as we need to register it with the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. But if we are not near an airport, we can go up to 200 feet without registration and without talking to the FAA. So the FAA and the FCC, the Aviation Authority and the Telecom Authority, we don't need to correspond with them once we are going to 200 feet or less. So that's an exam question. The maximum height above ground to which an antenna structure may be erected without requiring the FAA and registration with the FCC is as long as it is not at or near a public use airport, is 200 feet. All right, so we have a little grammar issue here, folks. I'll fix it for the slides. But you get the point. The diagram shows here 200 feet is fine as long as you're not near an airport. If you're near an airport, well, you have to register with the FCC and also talk to the FAA. All right, so here's the thing about it. As hams, when we go around putting up these antennas all over the place, people can have issues with it. Some people will say it's an eyesore. And of course, regulators, governments, in the case of the United States, you have federal, you have local government, and sometimes they want to have a heavy hand and tell you you cannot do this, you cannot do that. So as hams, there are a lot of pressures sometimes by communities to not put up these monstrosity of an antenna structure. Right? They see it as an eyesore, they see it as devaluing their property value, all sorts of issues they may have. If you're part of an HOA, homeowners association, that like what you have in the US, if you have you sign on and you sign an agreement, you sign a contract, well, you have to abide by whatever that contract says. However, if you're not part of a homeowners association and you just live in a community, the local government should not come and tell you, well, here what, you can't put up an antenna, Or if you put up the antenna, you need to keep it 3 feet above the ground or 10 feet above ground. They should not be able to tell you to do that. They should allow you as a ham radio operator reasonable access to putting up an antenna structure to do your communications. So there's actually provisions in the law in the United States for that. Again, the exception is if you're part of an HOA, you have to comply with that, because that is actually a private contract that you'll be signing, right? Which is separated apart from the law, the legal requirements, or the statutes. So this last bullet point speaks to us speaks to amateur radio operators of having some rights. Let's delve into the point. It says that state and local governments are permitted to regulate amateur radio antenna structures, but under the conditions that the amateur service communications must be reasonably accommodated. In other words, they have to allow us some leeway to put up antennas, and the regulations must constitute the minimum practical to accommodate a legitimate purpose of the state or local authority. In other words, they cannot act arbitrarily and just say, nah, you can't put up an antenna there at all, or you have to keep it on the ground, or nobody could see it. They have to be reasonable if they are regulating amateur radio operations in terms of structures and towers and so on. So as a ham, yes, you do have some rights, but of course, like every other right, it's in the context of rights of others. But don't feel powerless. Again, persons that are in an HOA, well, sorry to say, if your HOA says you cannot, well, you have to abide by that, right? But if you're not in an HOA, you should be permitted by your local regulatory authority, federal, state, local governments will or should permit you to erect structures. Right, a couple more slides. We're coming to the end. A couple more slides, right? So let's talk about beacons. Now, normally, as amateur radio operators, we do two-way transmission. That's what we call our equipment two-way radio, because we transmit, someone receives, and they will usually transmit back and we receive. So that's two-way radio, two-way transmission. But there's a concept called a beacon. And what a beacon is really a one-way transmission. It's a transmission on radio frequency that goes out for the purpose of checking or understanding propagation conditions. In other words, what are the conditions of the ionosphere at the moment? So around the world, and that's the diagram you'll see at the top here, there's a map, and you have these beacon stations, and all these stations will do is transmit periodically, short bursts, and if you can hear the beacon, that means there's propagation between you and wherever the beacon is coming from. So that's the purpose of beacons. And for the exam, we need to know that beacon stations, they continually transmit relatively low power signals, and they have a power limit of no more than 100 watts PEP. And remember, PEP is peak envelope power. We do have a slide on that coming up. For the purpose, as identified in the FCC rules, for observing the observation of propagation. And propagation, that's the conditions in the ionosphere, and reception. So you can tune into the beacon frequency like this radio is. It's listening to the beacons. And if you hear a particular transmission from Australia, that means, ought to mean that because of reciprocity, you have good or reasonably good conditions between yourself and Australia. If you're hearing the transmitter in India, or if you're hearing the transmitter in South America or in Hawaii or wherever, that means you have good propagation conditions. And that's what beacons are for. You listen, at least one of the reasons for beacons, you listen and you say, yes, propagations or props are good. Or you're not hearing the beacon, you say props are bad. Maybe there was just a solar flare and it killed everything. Or maybe, in the high sunspot cycle and the ionosphere is really conducive to refracting that transmission on the frequency concerned, and you can say good condition. So that's what beacons are used for, to check propagation conditions. So there are some requirements that we need to know also for the exam for beacon station, that a condition to which beacon stations must comply. Notice the must is that there must, treat must as shall, right? Must comply is that there must be no more than one beacon signal transmitting in the same band from the same station location. What does that mean? It means if I'm operating a beacon station, I cannot have two transmissions in the same band simultaneously. Right? You cannot do that. You just use one frequency in that band. You can have another frequency in another band, but not more than one frequency in the same band as a beacon station. Okay. So another exam question is, if our beacon station is to be automatically controlled, then that is permitted in a very specific frequency range. In HF, it's between 28.2 and 28.3. So you just need to learn that. You can have an automatically controlled beacon station on the 10-meter band that's between 28.2 and 28.3. Right? Notice this radio is actually tuned within that range, right? Automatically controlled. Also, as hams, we don't want to interfere with beacons, because beacons are there for us as an amateur radio community, all of us hams, ourselves included, and others, our colleagues, to be able to check propagation. So we should not go and somehow try to transmit to interfere with those beacons. So we should keep these frequencies listed on your screen here clear. So amateur operators normally avoid transmitting on 14.1, 18.110, 21.150, and 24.930, and 28.200 megahertz. These frequencies, because a system of propagation beacon stations operates on these frequencies. And just by the way, it's called the International Beacon Project. If you can go to this website here, ncdxf.org, it's also sponsored by the IARU. These beacon stations, they maintain them. So this is an exam question. Right. So another type of one-way transmission is when we receive weather reports or propagation forecasts from government stations. So that is another type of one-way transmission. So we did say a beacon station is a type of one-way transmission that we use as amateur radio operators. Another type is weather and propagation condition transmissions. Those are essentially broadcasts in a way, right? One-way transmission. Also, another permissible one-way transmission on amateur radio frequencies is Whiskey 1 Alpha Whiskey will transmit Morse code practices that you can listen to and copy. So those are the 2 bullet points. These are 2 exam questions, that one-way transmissions are permitted for occasional retransmission of weather and propagation forecast information from the US government stations, as well as transmissions to assist with learning the international Morse code. Right, so this here is the latest and greatest version of the Whiskey 1 Alpha Whiskey Morse code practice. They will send Morse code during these times, right? So this is just the schedule here. All right. Okay, so let's deal with a couple of restrictions and what are some of the things that we can do with our amateur radio license. So remember, one of the reasons we get our ham license is to be able to communicate with other like-minded individuals, other amateur radio operators around the world. We want to have a QSO, we want to have a conversation, we want to talk, we want to have a RAC2, we want to talk technical topics, we want to be productive, we want to do emergency communications, we want to improve the art of communication, our skill, we want to help each other, we want to create camaraderie, we want to have a community of amateur radio operators. That's part of what we are doing the training for, to get licensed to be able to do, to use our equipment to communicate. So this first bullet point speaks to the fact that as a ham radio operator, you can usually communicate with any other ham that is licensed, whether it's within your country or any other country, as long as that country has not said, you know what, we do not want our hams to be able to communicate with hams from another country. And for them to do that, they will have to notify the International Telecommunications Union, also known as the ITU, if they so wish. But as of right now, I don't believe there are any such restrictions. So just note that you can communicate globally, worldwide, again, within your privileges on the frequencies and so on, but note that it is possible for one day for a country to say, look, you cannot communicate with our amateur radio operators. And that's the first bullet point. It is permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the FCC when the contact is with amateurs in any country except those whose administrations, meaning governments, or telecoms authority, have notified the International Telecommunications Union, that's the ITU, that they object to such communications. Right? So the government or the telecoms authority tells ITU, we do not want any other hams or hams from this country to communicate with our hams or our amateur radio operators. So just be aware of that provision. It's an exam question. We are not currently aware of any such restrictions. Okay, so here's a restriction. We can utilize sometimes people call them codes, right? So we'll use the word codes. Morse code, Q code, pro signs, codes. Outside of English, right? We can use some codes, right? There are some generally accepted codes. But we need to be aware that when we use those codification or those codes, that at no point in time must they be encrypted in a way that someone cannot make out what we are saying. They must be clear text. They must be interpreted by anybody who wishes to. So we cannot obscure the message. We cannot hide the message on amateur radio. There's no secret. You must be able to state whatever in English, or if you're using a pro sign or a Q code or any other generally accepted Morse code, if you're using phonetic alphabet, while they may be codifying something, it cannot be that it is proprietary, that nobody else knows how to interpret what you're saying. And that's the second bullet point. The restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service is that they may be used only if they do not obscure the meaning of the message. In other words, no secrets. All right, so this last bullet point speaks a little more to what I was discussing in terms of codification. You can modulate using a digital mode, for example, a transmission. Your computer does the talking, you're not speaking, and that is digital transmission. You can use digital voice. And of course, because it's a protocol, it has to have some kind of standard, because a protocol, just like any language, if you're speaking Spanish on one side of a transmission, we have to speak Spanish on the other side. We cannot be speaking English on one side and Spanish on the other side. The meaning will be lost. No one will be able to interpret. So both sides have to be speaking the same language, or the protocol needs to be the same, right? Of course, unless you have a translator in between. So digital modes allow you to do that. You can take your voice, digitize it, put it on the air, and it received on the other side, and they can decode it. But these digital modes, when we encode onto radio frequency, the standard for, or the protocol must not be a mystery. It must not be a secret. The protocol itself must be publicly documented. You cannot come up with your own protocol and share it with another ham, and hey, the two of us are the only ones in the world that are using this protocol, and we are the only one could communicate in it, and no one else can listen and eavesdrop. No, that is not permitted in amateur radio. Clear text, or publish your protocol. So if you come up, so if I came up with the Robbie protocol, very fast, it uses very little bandwidth, it's very efficient, I have to publish the Robbie protocol publicly on the internet, send it out, make sure so that anyone who wishes to listen in on transmission could look at the publication and have access to decode our transmission. So that's the last bullet point. Before using a new digital protocol on the air, it is necessary, in other words, must, shall, to publicly document the technical characteristics of the protocol. Again, no secrets. All right, let's talk about what is good amateur practice and what is good engineering, right? So just from an operation standpoint, some extra information here. Again, we are hoping that everyone who attends these classes become good amateur radio operators. We're hoping that you represent. We would not want you to be badly behaved or inappropriate or, out of proper etiquette and so on. Must have come through this program and be a good standing member in the amateur radio community, professional operation. I mean, none of us are perfect, but we strive for excellence. We should demonstrate good amateur radio operating practice. And hopefully this course has given a little bit of insight as to what that is. There's a lot more to learn, a lot more to do besides this course. However, we know that when we are going to transmit on a frequency, we need to make sure that the frequency that we select is one that we can use with our license. So if we are a technician class, we should not be on most of the HF spectrum, with a little exception. If we are general class, we can do some HF, yes, but not all. And if we're extra class, well, we have full privileges. So we need to know our class and stay within our class. And also mode, right? There are some modes that we cannot do in particular pieces of the spectrum as well, right? So as a technician class, you may not be able to do voice and a lot, or any of the HF, but you might be able to do Morse code, right? You might be able to do a digital mode in a little piece on the 10-meter band, but you may not be able to speak. So stay within your frequency range and mode. Also, make sure that you pay attention to the band plan. So that chart, let's pull it back again. This is a summary band plan, right? They are detailed band plans, but this one gives you a pretty good idea. Stay within the band plan. Yes, a lot of what is here is considered voluntary. However, you need to stay within your class of license as well, right? So some of it is voluntary and some of it is regulatory. So, coming back to the slide, so apart from using the correct frequency, the correct mode for our license class, and we also want to make sure that we observe and respect the band plan, we also need to make sure before we transmit that we listen before we speak. So, some of us start to talk before we listen. So as hams, we do not do that. We listen. The bullet point is said, monitor the frequency before transmitting. So this is extra information. But again, while we provide it, we would like everyone, once you become a licensed amateur radio operator and you get on the air, to try to remember these principles and practice it. We want you to represent properly in the amateur radio community. Again, all of us may make little faux pas, little errors and so on, and hopefully someone will just pull us up and remind us, but we should strive. We should try to memorize these concepts, have them at the back of our mind. So once we get on the air, we practice these things. Let's move on. There's an exam question here, and it speaks to what is good engineering, good amateur practice. So Part 97, and everyone has a copy, a PDF version of the Part 97 rules and regulations from the FCC. We encourage you to look through it because a lot of the exam questions are taken directly from this, or the theories come from this Part 97. So it pays attention to keep it with your station. Pay attention to do look. We showed you how to code, how the questions are coded, how to get to the relevant section in the, we'll come to a slide on that again, just to remind you how to look for it in the Part 97. But when we talk about good amateur practice and good engineering, first reference will be this Part 97. Right, that's the first reference. And if something in here is not very well clearly stated, whatever we do should be in accordance with this Part 97 anyway. That's the exam question. The FCC, Federal Communications Commission, determines good engineering and good amateur practice. They are the authority. When we say good engineering, they will tell us what good engineering is. Good amateur practice, they will tell us also. It's there according to their standard, not according to our own individual standard. We use this as the guiding principle, that Part 97 for our rules and regulations, as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects. Notice they didn't say some, piece, a little bit, it's in all respects not conferred by Part 97 rules. So the FCC determines that, right? Not you or I. I mean, we can weigh in an opinion, we can interpret, but at the end of the day, the FCC determines. All right. So we have covered PEP before, But because we're coming to a couple of slides that we're talking about power in terms of PEP. What is PEP? PEP means peak envelope power. So oftentimes when we get a specifications about power or power limit, it is given relative to PEP. And we need to know what PEP is. PEP is this. If you have a transmission, this is a sinusoidal wave. This is your signal. Notice that there are peaks and troughs in our signal. This is our peak envelope power, right? So we have provided to you here graphically so you can see what it is, right? And we need to know that the measurement specified by the FCC rules that regulate maximum power is given in PEP. So you'll see next couple of slides, we'll say 100 watts PEP. Anytime you see that, that means it's peak envelope power and it's relative to the output from the transmitter, right? So peak envelope power is always in reference to the transmitter output power. And this is where it is at. So of course, if you're talking single sideband, that will have, as opposed to AM, as opposed to FM, you need to pay attention to the waveform and determine what is peak envelope power. All right. Again, a little tip here, notwithstanding the maximum power that you can use as a ham, general guiding principle is that we must use no more power than is necessary to make the communication. So in other words, not because we have 1.5 kilowatts or 1500 watts and we have an amplifier that could do all of that, that we're talking to someone just, a short distance away, that we could have used half a watt or QRP mode to communicate that we're going to drive 1,000 watts off 1.5 kilowatts. That's not good amateur practice, right? All right. So on the various bands, we need to be aware of the maximum amount of power that we can use on the various bands. So again, we have taken our trusty diagram, the band chart here, and exploded or pulled out and zoomed on in to various sections to answer the other theoretical questions that we'll get in the exam. So we need to be aware that the maximum amount of power that we can use as a ham, radio operator, when we are transmitting is given by the regulations. That part 97, the regulations specify. We don't just determine arbitrarily how much power we can use. The maximum is given by the regulation. And the amount is not necessarily the same across the bands. Matter of fact, it can vary. Several bands, yes, there's a common value, and you'll see that coming up shortly. But there are some bands where the power maximum is different. Again, usually because of restrictions, avoiding interference, and so on. It's not arbitrary. It's there for a reason, the power limitations. So let's go with them quickly. All of these are exam questions. So the limit for transmitter power on the 28 megahertz band. So the 28 megahertz band is this here. So we have pulled it out from this chart. This is the 28 megahertz band. And the 28 megahertz band is the 10 meter band, right? So remember, to convert between meters and frequency, you use 300. We'll come up with the slide again, that little trusty slide to convert. And they will give you some questions. Sometimes they'll talk about megahertz band. Sometimes they'll tell you about the meter band. So we need to be able to be fluent in converting between megahertz and wavelength, right? So the 28 megahertz band for a general class control operator, that's us, we are doing a general class level, is 1.5 kilowatts peak envelope power or 1500 watts. So a lot of the HF spectrum, we are allowed to use 1500 watts. How do we know that? If we were to look at our band chart, we have exploded this top section here. We are looking at this section of the band chart. We have exploded it here, and we'll notice when we zoom on in, we see 1.5 kilowatt PEP, right? So that's 1.5 kilowatts. To go to watts, we multiply it by 1,000, so we get 1,500 watts. Again, it's peak envelope power. We did say that's why we had a slide on PEP, because a lot of the power limits are given in respect of PEP. Remember what PEP is that maximum that you can. It's also in context of the waveform, and it is also in context of the transmitter output power. So this is where we get the 1,500 watts from. It didn't show up out of thin air, right? We're using the band chart. If you look at the regulations, you'll see it as well. So for 28 megahertz, also known as the 10 meter band, it's 1500 watts. That's an exam question. Also, next exam question for the 1.8 megahertz band, which is also known as the 160 meter. So we have exploded that out, zoomed on here. This is the 160 meter band or the 1.8 megahertz band. This also allows us 1500 watts, right? So you're starting to see a little pattern here. Next exam question for the 12 meter band. Now notice here they were giving us megahertz all the time, 28 megahertz, 1.8 megahertz. I just put in here for your reference what the meter band is, right? But in the exam, 1.8 megahertz, 28 megahertz. Notice here they didn't tell us megahertz, they told us 12 meter. I put in here for us that we know that it's a 24 megahertz band, right? So they'll try to mix you up and put different things to tie you up, but you know how to convert between the wavelength and the frequency, right? So this should not tie us up too much. So watch out for that. So it's a 12 meter band. Again, that's this section of the chart here. The 12 meter band, also known as the 24 megahertz band, is also 1500 watts. So these three questions, the 28 megahertz band, the 1.8 megahertz band, the 12 meter band, also known as the 24 megahertz band, is 1500 watts, all these three. And again, this is where we get it from, it's 1.5. But there are exceptions, and we'll come to an exception now. The maximum transmitting power an amateur station may use on the 10.140 megahertz, which is a frequency, is 200 watts peak envelope power. Where did we get that from? Well, if we were to look at the 30 meter section, and we have it exploded here, we'll notice that unlike these here where they don't generally have a frequency, a power limitation. Okay, this one has here for novice and technician, they're limited to 200 watts here, right? But extra advanced and general, there's no limitation indicator, right? Notice here also for the 160 meter band, no limitation. So it's 1.5 kilowatts unless specified otherwise. And we have specified otherwise here for the 30 meter band. So notice 200 watts for everybody. The extra class, the advanced class, the general class, everybody gets maximum 200 watts peak envelope power, and that's the exam question. So all of these and many of these exam questions are coming from the regulations, are coming from this band chart. That's why we say this chart is your friend. All right. So also keeping with transmitter power, again, we have pulled out the 60 meter band from this chart here. Right? This is the 60 meter band. And we have zoomed on in because we have some exam questions in relation to this. You'll probably be guessing, all right, it's not the 1.5 kilowatts. It's some other value, and you'll be right. Notice here, for the 60 meter band, they are saying for the extra, the advanced class, the general class, they are limited to 100 watts. It's also stated here in the little write-up, it says maximum effective radiated power of 100 watts PEP relative to a half-wave dipole, right? And because hams are secondary here also, so that's why they're not giving you much power, right? So the maximum power limit on the 60 meter band is an effective radiated power of 100 watts PEP with respect to a dipole. Okay, let's deal with the last question here. Also, when operating in the 60 meter band, if you are using an antenna other than a dipole, it is a requirement of the FCC rules that you must keep a record of the gain of your antenna. So if you're not using a dipole like this, you're using a beam on the 60 meter band that is directional, that has gain, you need to keep a record logged. All right, exam questions. All right, so our last slide before we, we have a couple extra pieces here. I know we have gone extra on time. Still have the question pool review to do, but we have a couple extra pieces of information that hopefully persons will find interesting about the solar flare that occurred today. All right, so feel free, if you have to leave, go right ahead, but feel free, we have some extra information. Should just take us a couple of minutes. So last slide in the theory has to do with the 60 meter band. So again, we have excerpted the 60 meter band here. Right, notice, right? Again, we'll notice something about the 60 meter band. For the purpose of the exam, we need to know that on the 60 meter band, when we are operating upper sideband or USB, we must stay within a bandwidth limit of 2.5 kilohertz, and this is what we are trying to show here diagrammatically. So if we are operating a single sideband transmission, and we are doing, let's say, upper sideband, for instance, that must not occupy more than 2.8 kilohertz, because the FCC rules specify it must not exceed, right? So this is the exam question. The maximum bandwidth permitted by the FCC rules for amateur radio stations transmitting on USB frequencies in the 60-meter band is 2.8 kilohertz. So quite a mouthful. So this is the 60-meter band. It's the 5.3 megahertz band also, right? And when we are doing single sideband operations, 2.8 kilohertz is the maximum bandwidth. In other words, the road that we are taking, we must not use all of the lanes. We must stay in our lane. We must only utilize this piece of the spectrum for the signal and no more. Can stay in our lane. Right. So these two questions have been withdrawn from the exam. So if you have a book that has these two exam questions, G1C08 or Gulf 1 Charlie 08 and G1C10 or Gulf 1 Charlie 10, they are no longer valid, and that's just because the FCC recently had a rule change that removed the restrictions for the symbol rates. Okay, this is the extra slide. Okay, we see everyone has stayed with us, so let's go with this slide quickly. So today, we in the class we've been talking about the importance of the sun, the sunspot cycle, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, auroras, the importance of the sun ionizing the ionosphere, and so on, right? So today, there was a solar flare. It was an X-class solar flare, I think X-class 2.5. And this is what it looks like. Here it is. This is the blip. And if you look at the blip here, you'll notice that it's at the X level. So you have C class, M class, X class. And this flare was at the X class level. And this is actually a picture that was snapped at the time of the flare. Notice this here. That's the flare. Very bright flash. And that, if you remember from the theory, it takes about 8 minutes to reach Earth. And it would have likely resulted in a little bit of radio blackout, right? So it's an X class, which is very strong. X class flares are amongst the strongest. You have the C class, you have the M class, and you have the X class flares. All right, so that's a bit of extra information happened today. This is the time here, time scale in UTC, and you can see the very clear peak X class. And here's a strong C class flare, all right? All right. So let's go straight into the question pool, and just remember how we codify. All of the question pool questions will have the question pool number, what the answer is, and if it's in reference to part 97, here's the part 97 reference. We encourage you to read in detail the part 97. Make some time to do it. It will help you as a ham radio operator. So folks, let's go quickly and see if we can speed through the question pool. Let me just share. Right. So again, we go in extra time today, folks, again. All right. So let's deal with the questions in the question pool related to all of the theory we covered this evening. Right. Where should lightning arresters be located? So we learned they should be where the feed line enters the building. Where should the station's lightning protection ground system be located? Outside the building, right? So notice everything is outside, not inside. Lightning protection and ground. Which of the following is covered by the National Electrical Code, also known as the NEC? Electrical safety of the station. According to the National Electrical Code, what is the minimum wire size that may be used safely for wiring with a 20 amp circuit breaker? So we did two of them, right? We did both a 20 amp and a 15 amp. So for the 20 amp, the AWG is 12. And the next question deals with the other size. Which size of fuse or circuit breaker would be appropriate for the use of a circuit that uses AWG number 14? And we said that's 15 amps. So remember, the 14, 15, right? And then the other one will be 20 or 12. So 14, 15. If you can remember that, aid de memoire should help you. All right. Which of the following conditions will cause a ground fault circuit interrupter or GFCI to disconnect AC power? It is current flowing from one or more of the hot wires directly to ground. Which wire or wires in a 4-conductor 240 volts AC circuit should be attached to fuses or circuit breakers? Let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? Which wire or wires? All right. So that means the hot wire, the ground, the neutral, which one? In a 4-conductor, so it has 4 conductors, 240 volts AC. So that means there'll be 2 hot, 1 ground, and 1 neutral, right? So 4-conductor 240 volt AC circuit should be attached to fuses or circuit breakers. Where do we put fuses or circuit breakers? Do we put it on the neutral? No. Do we put it on the ground? No. We put it only on the hot wires. And that's the answer, only the hot wires. Next question in the question pool. What is the purpose of a power supply interlock? It is to ensure that dangerous voltages are removed if the cabinet is open. Next up, which of the following is true of an emergency generator installation? The generator should be operated in a well-ventilated area. Remember I said those types of generators may use diesel or gasoline, right? So if it's that type, fumes, carbon monoxide poisoning. Which of the following is a danger from lead, tin, soda? Lead can contaminate food if hands are not washed carefully after handling the soda. So, wash your hands if you handle soda. Wash it very, very well. Okay. So, commission rules questions now. Which HF bands has segments exclusively allocated to amateur extra licensees? So, we kind of gave you a little way to remember. It starts with 80, then go to 40, 20, then 15. So, it's always half going down except the last one. If you look at the distractors, it says all HF, it's not. All HF except it's not. Then this one goes 60, 30, 17, 12, But these are nicely divisible. So 80 divided by 2 is 40, divided by 2 is 20. So if that helps you remember the answer, power be to you. So 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters. They have sections exclusive for the amateur extra licensee. So when you get your general class, you have motivation to get the extra class, to get access to those privileges and those segments of the bands, those portions of the spectrum. Next question in question pool. On which HF and or MF amateur bands are there portions where general class licensees cannot transmit? So it's the corollary question. It's very similar to the previous question. It's also where the amateur extras will have extra privileges. It's the same 80, 40, 20, 15 meters. So the answers for both are the same. It's just asking the question in a different perspective. One says where the extra class has exclusive, and the other one is basically saying where does the general class not have, right? And they become the same answer because once you upgrade from general to extra, you get everything. If you don't upgrade, you miss out on the extra stuff. So that's why the answer is the same. Okay, when general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portion of the band, which portion of the voice segment is available to them? So remember we showed you several of those sections where a general class cannot have the full voice section or voice portion, but they have access. Where they have access is always the upper, the rightmost portion of the band. So the answer is the upper frequency portion. Next question. On which of the following frequencies are general class licensees prohibited from operating as control operator? So because this portion here, 7.125 to 7.175, that is for the extra class, therefore the general class cannot operate there. So just memorize that, 7.125, 7.175, that range. Look at the distractor questions, right? Okay, which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 15 meter band, right? So that is just plucking a frequency from the range that a general class can have. So for the 15 meter band, 21.3 is valid. Right? Some of these are not even in the 15 meter band, right? Right, so that's where it pays to know. Again, remember that trick we taught in the technician class? Last slide up, you'll see it again. 300 is your friend. Whatever it is divided into 300, So 15 into 300 is 20, right? So approximately 20, so 21, right? So that's how you convert meter band to frequency. If you get lost, what is 15 meter band again? Think 300. 300 divided by 15, 20. Okay. Right. And next up, on which amateur frequencies in the 10 meter band may stations with a general class control operator transmit CW emissions? Well, 10 meter band, general class operator has full privileges across the entire segment, and therefore that's the answer, the entire band. What portion of the 10 meter band is available for repeater use? So we said that as a specific section, it is anything above the 29.5 megahertz mark. When may a 10 meter repeater transmit the 2 meter signal from a station that has a technician class operator? Let's dissect this question. Once you have a 10 meter repeater, it is owned by a general class licensee, but there is an operator who has a technician class license. They transmit 2 meters to the repeater, and they can legally get that transmission onto the 10 meter band through this repeater, because the repeater, the 10 meter repeater that is owned and operated by a general class licensee, and therefore that is what allows it to occur. So only if the 10 meter repeater control operator holds at least a general class. So the technician class operator wants to transmit via 2 meters, the signal will end up on the 10 meter band voice, and it can do so legally as long as the repeater control operator holds a general class license. All right, on which of the following bands is phone operation prohibited? So let's dissect this. They're asking us which band, but what? Phone operation. So again, in amateur radio, whenever we talk about phone, that's voice, speech, we are talking. Which band you cannot talk on? We said that is the 30 meter band. Cannot talk there. On which of the following bands is image transmission prohibited? Same band. You cannot talk, and you cannot use images either, right? So 30 meter band is the answer. Which of the following amateur band or amateur bands is restricted to communication only on specific channels rather than frequency ranges? Let's dissect that question. So we did say there's one band that is channelized. You cannot use VFO mode. You cannot use your tuning dial or up-down dial and tune to any frequency in the band. You have to use, well, you tune it that way, yes, but you have to go to specific channels. You can't tune anywhere in between you want. You have to use those channels, and that's why we say it's channelized operation. And that band is the 60 meter band, 60. Which of the following applies when the FCC rules designate the amateur service as a secondary user on a band? Well, we talked about when we are primary and when we are secondary. When we are secondary, amateur stations must not cause harmful interference to primary users and must accept interference from primary users. What is the height? I say again, what is the maximum height above ground for an antenna structure not near a public use airport without requiring notification to the FAA and registration with the FCC? Again, that's Aviation Authority, and that's the Telecommunications Organization. What is the maximum height? The maximum height is 200 feet. After that, you have to register and seek permission and so on, right? Under what conditions are state and local governments permitted to regulate amateur antenna structures? The amateur service communications must be reasonably accommodated, and regulations must constitute the minimum practical to accommodate a legitimate purpose of the state or the local entity. Yes, they can regulate us, but they also need to be reasonable and not prevent us from operating. Which of the following is a purpose of a beacon station as identified in the FCC rules? Well, the purpose is the observation of propagation and reception. See where our signals can be heard or what signals we are hearing from our location, where they're coming from. Tells us what we probably could communicate if we were to go on the air and want to have a QSO, where our transmissions or signals can reach and where and who we are likely to hear from. Next up, what is the power limit for beacon stations? 100 watts peak envelope power. If you have a beacon, no more than 100 watts. With which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply? No more than one beacon station may transmit in the same band from the same station location. Okay. On what HF frequencies are automatically controlled beacons permitted? It is permitted, automatically controlled. That's the key here. Automatically controlled beacon, and we did say it's between 28.20 and 28.30. That's the range of the HF in the HF spectrum that automatically controlled beacon stations are permitted. Why should an amateur operator normally avoid transmitting on 14.100, 18.110, 21.150, 24.930, and 28.200 megahertz? Those frequencies, why should we avoid transmitting there? It is because a system of propagation beacon stations operate on those frequencies. We don't want to interfere with that. We ourselves may want to use them. All right, which of the following transmissions are permitted for all amateur stations? Well, occasional retransmission of weather and propagation forecast information from US government stations, right? Okay. Which of the following one-way transmissions are permitted? So transmissions that will assist in learning the International Morse Code. Whiskey 1 Alpha Whiskey. All right. When is it permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the FCC? So that's outside of the United States, right? Well, that's pretty typical of hams, right? We communicate across borders, across countries, right? So that's what we are trying to do also. We don't only want to communicate locally. I mean, how much fun is that when you can communicate globally? So it is when the contact is with amateurs in any country, except those whose administrations or governments or authorities have notified the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, that they object to such communications. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service? Well, they may be used so long as they do not obscure the meaning of the message. Remember we said no secrets. You can't encode, you cannot encrypt, generally. There's a little exception, right? All right, what must be done before using a new digital protocol on the air? Again, similarly, we cannot have a protocol that obscures the message, that encodes it in a way that it cannot be decoded. So no secrets. Well, if we have a new protocol, we have to publicly document the technical characteristics of the protocol. That's so that anybody could decode our transmissions. Who or what determines good engineering and good amateur practice as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects not covered by Part 97 rules? So who determines what is good engineering and good amateur practice? It's the FCC, not you, not I. All right, what is the limit for transmitter power on the 28 megahertz band for general class control operator? So we said many of these frequency bands, it's 1500 watts or 1.5 kilowatts, so that's the answer. 1500 watts peak envelope power though. What is the limit for transmitter power on the 1.8 megahertz band? Also 1500 watts peak envelope power. What is the maximum transmitter power an amateur station may use on a 12 meter band? Again, they mix it up, they go from frequency to meter band, but we know it's still 1500 watts peak envelope power, also known as 1.5 kilowatts, right? That's the maximum legal limit. What measurement is specified by FCC rules that regulate maximum power? So all of these maximum power are given with respect to PEP, peak envelope power. So it's PEP output from the transmitter. What is the maximum transmitter power of an amateur station that may use 10.140 megahertz? So we did show for that particular band, the maximum is 200 watts PEP, not 1.5 kilowatts, not 1500 watts, right? Again, that band chart is our friend. What is the maximum power limit on the 60 meter band? An ERP, effective radiated power of 100 watts PEP, peak envelope power with respect to a dipole. That is 60 meter band, 100 watts. Which of the following is required by the FCC rules when operating in a 60 meter band? If you're using an antenna other than a dipole, you must keep a log or you must keep a record of the gain of the antenna. Once you're not using a dipole, using something else that's directional, that has gain, keep a record of that gain. And our last question in the question pool is, what is the maximum bandwidth permitted by FCC rules for amateur radio stations transmitting on USB frequencies in the 60-meter band? So we did say that that bandwidth must be 2.5 kilohertz and no more. All right, phew. All right, so a little marathon session this evening, folks. We really are trying to complete. And on that basis, we'll see if we can finish off in one more session. We may have one more plus another half session, but we will try to see if we could complete using one more session, right? Stage where we're at, it's probably doable if, again, everyone is willing to be a little extra time, right? All right, so folks, this slide here, well, we have been covering pages 123 to 135 in the No Nonsense General Class License Study Guide. Also, this chart here can be very useful to you. It talks about the frequencies that hams can use to transmit depending on your class of licenses. It gives you the equivalent wavelength to match the band. It tells you where's HF, where's VHF, where's UHF, what part of the spectrum you can use upper sideband, what part you can use lower sideband. It even shows us here where the FM broadcast band lies with respect to our spectrum and so on. It also shows us here the quick tip calculation. If you want to convert from wavelength to frequency or frequency to wavelength, you take any one and put it as the denominator, divide it into 300, and you will get the other value that will help you quickly circumnavigate to which one is the correct answer. If you don't know it offhand, you can use this. 300 is a number to remember. Just divide whatever into 300 and it should help you. All right. So folks, if you have any questions, feel free to send to this email address. We have WhatsApp available as well on this number. Also, a WhatsApp channel, feel free to subscribe. We do provide links to the Zoom session, also extra information that may be of interest to you. It's freely available, feel free to join. Our next session, and it's perhaps going to be our last session, we'll see if we can fit everything into one final session, or maybe we need to spread it over two. Let's just see, folks, how it goes. So our next session, God's willing, next week, Friday, 23rd of February. So thank you very much, everyone, especially for the extra time. We know we had a very long session, probably the longest that we have had to date. We thank you for the extra time. So everyone, continue to be safe. Do have a great weekend. Take good care, and we keep in touch.